Hi, I'm Noah. Welcome to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about classics that I actually enjoyed as a person who has historically disliked or outright hated classics. And that's the gist of it. I never enjoyed classics when I was younger because I thought that they were too difficult. I thought that the writing was too difficult to understand. I often felt like they were written in a different language. For example, I hated Shakespeare growing up, and I had to have lots of extra help in school for the Shakespeare units that we did because I always felt like Shakespeare had created his own version of English that was just impossible to understand. Luckily, now that I've done a lot of reading and a lot of growing in the forms of literature I'm able to consume, I do understand Shakespeare a little bit better now with some analysis, but you know, it was really hard before. And not just Shakespeare, I also hated F. Scott Fitzgerald, and I hated George Orwell, and I hated Hemingway, and I hated Louisa May Alcott. Any single author that we had to read in school, I hated. And I don't know if it was just like me being sort of rebellious, like, I'm not gonna do my schoolwork, or if I hated it because I just had such a hard time understanding it, and I also had a really hard time focusing on those higher reading level sort of books. But now I absolutely love most of the authors I just listed and other classics because I've found that there's ways to find classics that are more accessible to you as a reader. One of those ways is to read modern classics, to read short classics, to find classics that are a little bit more easy to understand in the sense that they're written more as if they were written in our modern times and not 100 years back. One of my favorite things to do when I want to read a classic, but I'm having a hard time with something like Charles Dickens, who's another author I used to hate, I'll pick up a more modern classic. That's one of my favorite things to do. I find that the NYRB classics are a lot more modern, meaning they were published more recently than like an older Penguin Black Spine classic. So sometimes looking at editions can be helpful. So today I'm going to talk to you about a very select amount of some of my favorite accessible, if you will, classics. And when I say accessible, I mean they're more easy to understand, maybe they're shorter, maybe they're widely known, so there's a lot of information online about them so that it's easier to understand something when you're confused because you could just look it up. Or on the other hand, most people have never talked about them before. They're not widely circulated around booktube or book social media in general. So maybe you haven't heard of them, which I'm excited for. Hopefully I have at least one book on this list that you have not heard of before, or you've barely heard of it and you want to learn more about it. Hopefully I can introduce you to a few books like that. There are some books on this list that are very, very widely known in the sense that I'm going to talk about it and you're going to say, why is that on the list? Like, that's obviously a book that everybody's heard of. And just bear with me, the reason those are on the list are because of their accessibility, and I'll talk about them a little bit less than I talk about the lesser known ones. Also, just a disclaimer that when I say lesser known or like nobody's heard of them or they're not really talked about, that's solely based on my own personal opinion and the circles that I have been on, booktube and bookstagram and other book social media platforms. So I may mention a book that I'm like, oh, this is not widely talked about, and then you may have seen a video like a couple days ago about that book in very specific detail, and that's totally fine. We're just in different circles. I do hope that it will reach somebody, maybe even one person who hasn't heard of the book before, and that's my goal. That's all I care about. So let's get started. I have 4 categories of books that I'm going to talk about. The first one is children's classics, which is another way to read accessible classics, is children's literature. Children's classics are made for children, so they're slightly easy to understand. Of course, if they're written a really long time ago, the writing will feel clunky and stilted based on what children's literature looks like today. But in the sense of comparing a children's classic to an adult classic, it'll be easier and more accessible to read. The second category I have here is nonfiction. I don't know if many people consider classics nonfiction. Defining what a classic is honestly going to be different for everyone. Some people call a book that was published 10 years ago a modern classic. Other people wouldn't consider a classic unless it was published at least 100 years ago. For me, it's honestly just a vibe. Classic is a vibe. Also, if the book itself says that it's a classic or a modern classic and it was published a long time ago, like 50, 100 years ago, then I'll be like, okay, it's a classic. You might disagree with what I'm saying, and that's totally, totally fine. You can definitely let me know what your definition of a classic is, because I am curious. I'm gonna tell you this. The literal definition of a classic book is a book that is considered exemplary or noteworthy and has stood the test of time. So that's a very broad description of what can be considered a classic. So if you're thinking about my list and you're thinking that book wasn't published long enough to be a classic, like that's stupid, just know that this is the definition of classic that I'm going off of, okay? These books that I'll talk to you about definitely endure the test of time, I will say that much. Even the ones that are lesser known and lesser heard of. Third category are classics that deal with sort of mental health as a main theme. And the fourth category is just kind of general because the rest of them kind of have their own categories, so I just clumped them all together. So we're gonna start with children's classics. The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett follows Mary Lennox, who is living in India with her very wealthy parents, and this family is a British family, but they're living in India, and she has a very, very, very spoiled, rich lifestyle. She has a maid to do everything for her. She doesn't even really dress herself. And I forgot to mention, she's a 10-year-old girl, so she's young, she's a child. And then a cholera epidemic kills her entire family and leaves her completely orphaned. So she's sent to live with her very reclusive uncle in the Yorkshire moors. And he's also rich, I would say, but in a different way. His house is huge, I mean it's a manor, and he has people to help out around the manor, and like maids, I would guess, servants I guess, but nothing like what Mary is used to, and so she has to sort of get used to this new existence. And it does seem like more than just being sad that her parents are literally dead. She's more upset about her change in environment and has a really hard time adjusting because of how spoiled she was previously. And when she's living in this manor, she's also bored. There's nothing to do, there's nobody to talk to, and so she wanders around outside and she finds a garden. But she doesn't only find a garden. She also finds that she has a cousin who's very sick and is screaming in the night, and she discovers him. She meets a gardener who she speaks to. She meets a robin who she becomes friends with. It's very whimsical. And then the garden is very decrepit, and so in secret she decides she's gonna sort of repair it. It's just a really beautiful book with really lush descriptions of the garden and the nature and how Mary sort of readjust to this new life that she's now living, and the way that the garden helps not only her to readjust but also helps her cousin, because it brings healthy nature and flowers to him when he's very ill, and it just brings a lot of happiness to Mary, and it's a really beautiful story. The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry is a very, very popular book. Of course, most people have probably heard of it, I would say, and it's a book in which the story itself is just as important as the illustrations, which are beautiful and so integral to the central story. So I would highly recommend getting a copy or reading a copy that has the original illustrations within it. But this book is about a pilot who finds himself stranded on the Sahara Desert, and when he comes to, he sees this boy, and he doesn't know who this random boy is, but the boy is asking him to draw him a picture and is explaining sort of where he comes from, which the little boy comes from a different planet and a different asteroid, I guess, to Earth to sort of explore life and what life is. And the book is really about love and friendship and isolation and what it really means to be a human being and what's truly important in life. It's very, very beautiful, and talk about a book that stands the test of time. This one will be around forever. I am so certain of that. The last children's classic I have as a recommendation is Heidi by Joanna Spyri, which was published in 1880. This is a book about a girl named Heidi, and she lives with her grandfather in the Swiss Alps, and she's very connected to the nature and the animals. And one day her grandfather, whom she lives with, goes down the mountains and stays with a disabled child, I believe, and learns a lot about life from that experience and brings it back. And the book is really just about nature and friendship and family. I think the thing I loved the most about Heidi was not only Heidi herself and the relationship she has with her grandfather, but the relationship that she has with the land that she lives on. It's very, very beautiful. It makes you want to go outside in nature and just appreciate nature for what it is and how beautiful it is. And Heidi is just such a cute, sweet, compelling main character, and I do also really love her grandfather. And the mountains and the Swiss Alps, it's just stunning. This one also has illustrations. Typically children's classics will have some form of illustration. This one just has fun illustrations that complement the text. Different, of course, to The Little Prince, where the illustrations are integral to the text, but the illustrations in this edition that I have, I think, are the original ones from the 1880 publication, and they're very, very cute. I just love Heidi. She's such a cutie. Now we're gonna move on to the next category, which is, we'll do nonfiction classics next. Letters to a Young Poet, which is very popular, and The Dark Interval, both by Rainer Maria Rilke. These books are beautiful, obviously. They are just incredible, but personally, this book is one of my favorites. This book actually sits on my all-time favorite books shelf. I actually liked this one significantly less, I have to be honest, but I do feel like this is most people's favorite. But let's talk about The Dark Interval, because The Dark Interval is collection of Rilke's letters, mostly about death. So the subtitle of the book, Letters on Loss, Grief, and Transformation. So essentially every single letter is a letter to somebody who has lost a loved one, and Rilke's either consoling them or explaining the ins and outs of life, I guess, to them, and how everybody dies. That sounds so mundane and so not intellectual, because it's just difficult to explain how beautifully this man has written about a topic that is so, it's taboo, it's scary, it's difficult, it's something that nobody ever wants to experience, and yet everybody will eventually experience grief and loss at some point. Likely most people experience it for the first time when they're young. Maybe they lose a pet or a grandparent. It's something that touches all of us, and it's something too that, despite the fact that it touches all of us, it's so terrifying to many of us, myself included. I, a couple years ago, was on sort of a mission to read a bunch of books that sort of console the psyche about grief, loss, and death, because part of my OCD, get a little personal here, part of my OCD is I have this intense fear of death, and it causes obsessions and compulsions. And so I wanted to sort of engage myself more with content about grief and loss as a sort of exposure on my own outside of therapy. I wanted to expose myself to different forms of literature, fiction and nonfiction, about death, sort of as a means of helping myself move forward in life and not be so stuck in the fact that, like, if you love someone, you'll eventually have to lose them. Because I think that's something that a lot of us are really afraid of. Why put yourself out there when someone's gonna leave or someone's eventually gonna die? Like, that's so sad. It makes me feel like I'm gonna cry right now, because at the end of the day, that's life. Everybody's gonna die. That's just what happens, and it's terrifying, and it's the one question that we'll never have the answer to. We'll never know what happens when you die, because you're dead. You can't come back to life and tell your story. Of course, there are stories of people who died for a few minutes, came back to life, and explained what happened to them, but other than that, there's no concrete proof of what happens after death. So it's a scary thing. All that ramble is to say that this book consoled me more than any piece of literature I ever read about death. I highly, if you feel any way similar to the way that I just explained that I feel, even if it's not OCD related, even if it's just a general fear, it's just, you're just really scared to lose the people you love, I recommend this book wholeheartedly. The Dark Interval by Rainer Maria Rilke, collections of letters on loss, grief, and transformation. It is absolutely incredible. It's just, I could open to any single page and something will be beautiful. Time itself does not console, as people say superficially. At best, it assigns things to their proper place and creates an order. And even this works only because later we pay so little mind and hardly give any consideration to that order to which time so quietly contributes, that instead of admiring everything that now softened and reconciled comes to rest in the great whole, we treat it as the forgetfulness and weakness of our heart, just because our pain is no longer as acute. Alas, how little the heart forgets. Instead, we should make it our deep and searing curiosity to explore such loss completely and to experience the particular and singular nature of this loss and its impact within our life. Indeed, we ought to muster the noble greed to enrich our inner world precisely with this loss and its significance and weight. I have never heard that explained so concisely and perfectly. When I looked for the person who had passed away, he gathered inside of me in peculiar and such surprising ways, and it was deeply moving to feel that he now existed only there. My enthusiasm for serving, deepening, and honoring his existence there gained the upper hand almost at the same moment when the pain would otherwise have invaded and devastated the entire landscape of my mind. When I remember how, often with the most extreme difficulties in understanding and accepting each other, I loved my father. During my childhood, my thoughts often became confused, and my heart froze at the mere thought that at some point he might cease to be. My existence seemed to me entirely determined by him, my existence which from the beginning was aimed in such a different direction, that to my innermost self his departure was synonymous with my own demise. But death is so deeply rooted in the nature of love. Ugh! And I do not mean this, of course, in that sentimental, romantic sense of renouncing or opposing life. But it is our friend, especially then, when we most passionately and profoundly consent to being here, to change, to nature, and to love. Life always says at once yes and no. Death, I implore you to believe it, is the true yes-sayer. It says only yes before eternity. Just think of the sleeping tree. How good that I just thought of it. Think of all the small pictures and their inscriptions, how, in your youthful, innocent faith, you always recognized and affirmed both in the world, the sleeping and the waking, the bright and the dark, the voice and the silence, la présence et l'absence, all the presumed opposites which converge somewhere in one point where they sing the hymn of their union, and this place is, for the time being, our heart. People have been scared and terrified by life's horrors, but is there anything sweet and wonderful that has not, from time to time, worn this mask, which is one of horror? Life itself, and we know nothing else besides it. Isn't it horrific? But as soon as we admit its horror, not as an opponent, for how could we measure up to it, but somehow trusting that this very horror is entirely ours, and merely at this moment still too great, too expansive, too ungraspable for our hearts which are still learning, as soon as we affirm life's most frightening horror at the risk of dying, that is, of our excess, we gain a hint of the greatest bliss that is ours at this price. The person who has not at some point accepted with ultimate resolve and even rejoiced in the absolute horror of life will never take possession of the unspeakable powers vested in our existence. Next, we'll talk about this book that everybody has heard of. This is The Diary of a Young Girl, Anne Frank. So, if you don't know, I hope you know, but Anne Frank was a Jewish girl during World War II living in Amsterdam, and her family were hidden by a close friend for many, many years during the Holocaust, until eventually they did unfortunately get caught. Anne Frank and her family were in hiding for 761 days before they got captured, and Anne died within 5 months of being in the concentration camp she was sent to, and very soon after that, people were liberated from the camps. She was so close. It's just such a heartbreaking story, but this book will stand the test of time forever. It's another one that really will, partly because of the story, of course, but also Anne Frank had a way with words. Her diary was absolutely the most eloquent diary you'll ever read. It's incredible how hopeful she stayed throughout. Of course, there are some moments where she's less hopeful, but given her circumstances, that's more than to be expected. It's just, she's a person of great strength. Like, she is a girl who is probably one of the strongest children, because she was a child, in our collective history. It's just incredible, and I'm so grateful that we have this, even though I'm obviously not grateful for what she had to go through for us to get it. But if you have never read this book, I really, really, really would recommend that you do as soon as possible, because this book in itself is a piece of history. Obviously, because it's a nonfiction, diary collection that she wrote, but it's a piece of history that will be with us for generations to come. I have The Art of Living by Epictetus. This is a book that I don't exactly know when it was originally written, just because Epictetus himself was alive in 55 to 135 CE. So, and then I guess it was collected by Sharon Labelle, who is a philosophical writer. I guess collected it. I don't really know. Please, I don't know how all that works. Please don't ask me. Somebody else can tell you, somebody who's like a little bit more intelligent, okay? So this is a really beautiful philosophical book that literally is just about being alive and just different concepts about life and living, as the title suggests. So instead of sitting here trying to explain to you the rest of the book, because that's pretty much all it's about, I'm going to read to you some parts of it. Epictetus was born into slavery about 55 CE in the eastern outreaches of the Roman Empire. Once freed, he established an influential school of Stoic philosophy, stressing that human beings cannot control life, only their response to it. The important thing is to take great care with what you have, while the world lets you have it, just as a traveler takes care of a room at an inn. I didn't underline or highlight a ton when I read this, but personal merit cannot be derived from an external source. It is not to be found in your personal associations, nor can it be found in the regard of other people. It is a fact of life that other people, even people who love you, will not necessarily agree with your ideas, understand you, or share your enthusiasms. Grow up. Who cares what other people think about you? Create your own merit. It's really good advice. And the way that this is written is not obviously how it would be written in the Roman Empire in 55 CE, because of how it was collected and then written down by this woman named Sharon Labelle. So that's what makes this book very accessible, of course. I mean, if it was written the way that it would have been spoken back then none of us would understand it, but somebody would. But pursue the good ardently, but if your efforts fall short, accept the result and move on. That's good advice. It's very self-help. It's a self-help book, but very old, essentially. Goodness exists independently of our conception of it. The good is out there, and it always has been out there, even before we began to exist. For the next category, I have 3 books that are centered around mental health topics. I'm not going to talk too much about them because I think all 3 of them are really well known, but I do want to briefly mention them because in case anybody has been thinking about reading these books and are nervous about how easy they are to understand or if they would have too hard of a time, I want to reassure you that these are pretty accessible. So first we have The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. Of course, everybody has heard of this book and many people have read this in school. This was a book I read in my junior year of high school, and it's the only book in all of high school that I actually liked and enjoyed and really kept up with reading. A lot of people say this is a red flag book. I personally love it. I love this book. I thought it was excellent. I reread it a few times. It's relatable. Unfortunately, I really related to it when I read it my junior year of high school, and it follows Holden Caulfield as he goes through life, and like I said, I'm not gonna give too much information about it just because I know everybody's heard of it before, but I do recommend it with the caveat that it was published in July of 1951, so you know there may be some problematic elements in it. However, it's just a wonderful story, and it very, very strongly centers around Holden Caulfield's mental health and how he ends up where he does, essentially. And I found that if you have struggled with mental health in some way, shape, or form, you'll likely relate to some aspect of this story. The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath, of course, another one that everybody's heard of. There's not a person alive who hasn't at least heard of The Bell Jar, but this one I will tell you a general plot summary just in case you're not fully aware of what it's about. So what it's about is a woman named Esther who is loosely based on Sylvia Plath herself. So it's a novel, but it's loosely autobiographical. And Esther is very successful. She's just doing really well on the outside, but slowly falling into the grips of insanity. It's a very potentially triggering book, so I would highly recommend going into it with caution, because, you know, the life of Sylvia Plath, she did kill herself eventually. She really struggled with severe depression and just general mental illness. Based on that simple fact that this is semi-autobiographical, please use caution going into it. But very, very, very good book, very accessible classic. Another book with some problematic elements, of course, because of its time period. So be wary of that when you go in as well. Go in with sort of the expectation that there will be things that you in 2025 know wholeheartedly would never fly in a book today. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey was published in 1962, and it's a novel of a mental institution is what it is. And the main character in this book sort of comes into the mental hospital and takes over and starts running the place, patient-wise, essentially. And it's a really great book. It's dark, it's funny, it's got some really humorous aspects. There's a lot of commentary on institutionalization of the 60s and what it was like and its problems, which there were a lot of them. Let me tell you right now, there were a lot of them. And it's a really engaging story. If you haven't seen the movie or read the book, I would say that you should read the book first, but I'll always say that you should always read the book before the movie, so that's not a surprise. But I do think that both of them are excellent. And now for the last category is just sort of, it's a general stack of books. First book, Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. This was one of my all-time favorite books for a long time. It sort of kind of dropped off because I tried to reread it and I just never finished. Once I finish, I have a feeling it'll go back to one of my favorite books of all time. I think Flowers for Algernon is just such a beautiful, heartbreaking story. It was published in 1959 for the first time, and Flowers for Algernon is about a man named Charlie with a very, very unusually low IQ, and because of that he's been chosen for this surgery that will potentially increase said IQ and make him smart. And he gets the surgery and it does work, and he sort of becomes even smarter than any doctor could have anticipated until he suddenly deteriorates. And so they're trying to figure out why, and we watch as he becomes so smart and so confident and so different. He just sort of becomes a new man, and then we watch the slow decline, and it's very, very heartbreaking. And Algernon is a mouse who got this same surgery before Charlie got it, and it was very successful for the mouse Algernon as well. And so the way the two stories intersect, obviously, because they both had the same surgery, but one's a mouse and one's a human, it's so beautiful and it's so heartbreaking, and the writing is ethereal. I highly recommend. It is so good. This book is more of a modern classic, I would say. It's called Territory of Light by Yuko Tsushima. This is a Japanese translated novel, and it follows a woman who is a single parent. Her husband up and leaves her, and she has to move into a new place. So she goes and gets an apartment in Tokyo, and it's her and her 2-year-old daughter. And her apartment in Tokyo is filled with light. The windows are big, it's flooded with light every single day, and yet the main character is going deeper and deeper into a pit of despair. She doesn't know how to handle her life now that it's so different and her husband has left, and she's raising this 2-year-old child who has many needs, as a 2-year-old does, on her own. She simply can't handle it. She doesn't know what to do with herself, with her daughter, with her life. And it's just the story of this woman and how she loses and takes back what's left of her life, essentially. And I just love the light streaming into the apartment as a sort of antithesis of the way that she feels, and how you think of light as this happy, bright thing that will make life better. If you're surrounded by light, how can you be depressed? Well, she is definitely depressed, and she's spiraling lower and lower and lower despite the beautiful setting that she's living in. This next one is one that I did hear about from BookTube, and that is Snow Country by Yasunari Kawabata. And I read this book at the end of December, and I meant to actually put this in my winter reads book recommendations, but I totally forgot, because this is a cold, snowy book, and it's very, very sad, and it has a very ambiguous ending. I actually had to do so much research when I finished this book, because I was like, I don't understand what just happened. What in the world is going on? But once I researched it, I was like, okay. But that's another thing that makes this more accessible, because the writing is a little bit more difficult, I would say. You really have to pay attention. You can't have anything in the background, at least I couldn't, to really fully grasp what's happening, just because of the way it's written. But it's not particularly difficult. It's just sort of requires more focus. I would say, but it's an excellent book. Very, very heartbreaking, about a wealthy man who takes a couple of trips to the hot springs where it's freezing cold. Every single surface is covered in snow, very, very cold. And he meets a woman who is a geisha, and he essentially starts up a relationship with her that's clearly more than just what the relationship would be between a wealthy man and a lowly geisha. It's very obviously more complex than that, and on the back of the book it calls it a doomed romance, and that is essentially what it is. And this is just, it's a heartbreaking story, and it's very cold. If you know, kind of taking it back to the winter reading recommendations. Add Snow Country to the list, because this is a freezing cold book, and it's also quite short. You could finish it pretty quickly. And this one came out in 1956. Demian by Hermann Hesse was first published in 1919. And if I could connect this book to any of the other books on this list, it would be The Art of Living by Epictetus. And that might be weird because this is nothing like that book. But the reason is because this book is about Demian, and his life, essentially, and how he lives it. And it just really reminded me upon reading of the principles and philosophical nature of The Art of Living, because this is sort of about a troubled man, Demian's life, and how he sort of changes things and sort of finds a path to spiritual enlightenment, I guess you could say. Demian is sort of searching for this level of self-awareness that he hasn't previously experienced through his life experience. He's trying to sort of better himself. And so it really felt like a philosophical story. And this one is incredibly accessible, text-wise, very easy to understand, extremely short, definitely novella length more than anything. And if you really like a character study, I think this one is a really good one for you to pick up. I apologize, this is a name that I cannot figure out how to pronounce. Dorothy Strachey. This was originally published in 1949 under a pseudonym. It has a loose base on the author's life, and the book follows Olivia, as the title suggests. She's a 16-year-old girl from England who is sent to a boarding school in Paris just to sort of broaden her education. Maybe that was a popular thing to do back then. There are many boarding school stories in that sort of time period. And when she gets there, keep in mind she's a 16-year-old child, she sort of falls into, I hesitate to call it love, I would maybe say more obsession, with one of her teachers, Mademoiselle Julie, I think, who introduces Olivia to so many things that she had never previously been introduced to, such as different forms of art and music and cuisine, and sort of just widens her view on life in general. And as the school year goes on, there's obviously a lot of issue with the relationship that she and Mademoiselle Julie have cultivated. And it's a sad book. It has sort of a tragic ending, if I'm remembering correctly. This is one that I don't hear talked about very often, and I do think it's a really well done portrayal of teenage obsession and the inappropriateness of teenagers, and as well the inappropriateness of the teenager adult relationship, especially when there's like a power dynamic. Yeah, I think this one is a pretty incredible read. That concludes the book recommendations for this video. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please maybe give me a like or subscribe to my channel. I try to post twice a week, so if you're interested in more of this type of content, please subscribe and give me a like. I so appreciate you being here. I hope I could provide you with at least one book recommendation for something you maybe never heard of, never had the courage to read. I don't know, I hope I provided you with something, or that you simply just had a good time sitting and hanging out with me. So thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next one, hopefully. That's it. Bye!